Hello and welcome back to Data Analysis and Visualization. I'm Chavita Christie, and in this video, I'm going to explain to you how you can classify your variables based on their roles and how that can be used to draw inferences from those variables later on. So let's begin. Why do we need a role type classification? Because while it is fundamentally important to know how to describe the distribution of a single variable, most studies they pose a research question that involves exploring the relationship between two variables using the collected data. So far, whatever we have done in the previous videos is study how one variable is distributed, but most of the research questions are about how one variable is related to another variable, and then studying the relation between them and finding how they affect each other. So that's why it is important to classify these variables. So the questions that you might have are questions like, is there a relationship between gender and test scores on a particular standardized test? So that means, is it that if a person is a female, then she is more likely to score? This is just an example. So we are trying to find out if there is a girl, then is the girl more likely to score better on a test than a boy? So this is the type of relationship we would like to find out. We would like to answer such a question. Is there a relationship between the gender of a person and the score that the person gets in a test? Another type of question is there a relationship between the type of light that a baby sleeps in? And so the types of lights are no light, night light, and a lamp. So these are the different types of lights. Does that affect whether or not the child is going to develop nearsightedness? So basically, we are trying to answer the question whether the light that the baby sleeps in is affecting the vision of the child. So this is another type of research question that we would like to answer by performing all these statistical calculations. The other types of questions that you can have are, how well can we predict a student's GPA from his or her performance in an entrance test? So once again, we are trying to relate two variables, which is the GPA of a student and entrance test score. So if you are given somebody's entrance test score, then can you decide how much their GPA would be in the college later on? So this is another type of classification, another type of question that you can have. There's also one more question, that is there any relationship between the time a person has practiced driving while having a learner's permit and whether or not this person passed the driving test? So we know that whenever a person applies for a driving license, they first get a learner's permit, and then they have to practice driving, and after a couple of months they can go to the driving test. So is there a relationship between how much time that person spends practicing within this time period with whether or not the person passes the driving test? So this is another question that you can have from the data given to you. Now, in most studies involving two variables, each of the variables has a role. Each variable is having some role. So if you have two variables like we saw in the questions before, then each variable has a different role to play in the analysis. And we distinguish these variables into two parts. One is known as an explanatory variable, which is also commonly known as an independent variable. So this is the variable that claims to explain, predict, or affect the response. So this is not the variable that we are trying to predict or we are trying to find out. This is the variable that's going to help us to predict something else or to find something else out. So this is known as the explanatory variable or an independent variable. The second type of variable that we have is a dependent variable. So this is the variable on which the outcome of something depends. So you could have a variable through which you are going to decide whether or not something will happen. So you're predicting, that is an explanatory variable, and the variable that you are actually trying to predict or find out is the response variable, also known as a dependent variable. Now we are going to also try to classify the variables that we saw in the questions we saw earlier. So typically the explanatory variable, whenever we are going to perform calculations, we will name the explanatory variable as X and the response variable as Y. So independent is X and dependent is Y. Now, the first question we had was, is there a relationship between gender and test scores on a particular standardized test? So we are trying to find the relationship between gender and test scores. So there are two variables in play. One is gender, another one is a test score. Now, gender is something based on the question will be given to you. But based on the gender, you want to predict a person's test score. So can you predict a person's test score given the gender? That means gender is explanatory, but test score is the response variable. Gender is independent, and test score we are trying to predict based on gender. So test score is a dependent variable in this question. Let us see another type of question. So another type of question that we saw is there a relationship between the type of light a baby sleeps with, which can be no light, night light, or lamp, and whether or not the child develops nearsightedness? Now, once again, based on the question, we can see what we need to predict is whether the child can develop nearsightedness. And we have to predict that based on the data given about what kind of light the child sleeps in. So once again, the explanatory variable is light type, the type of the light, and the response variable is whether or not the child develops nearsightedness. So nearsightedness, yes or no question, is your response variable. Let's take a look at the next question. The next question we saw had something to do with the GPA of a student based on the entrance test score. So if you are given the entrance test score of a couple of students, can you decide what their GPA is going to be? Can you decide how much they will score in the college based on their entrance test score, which they gave in order to get admitted into that college? So that's why the given thing, the thing that is given to you, data provided to you, is the entrance test score. So that will be your explanatory variable. But the response to that, which is the GPA, which you have to predict, is going to be your response variable. So that is how you can classify it in this question. Let us see the next question. The next question is there a relationship between the time a person has practiced driving while having a learner's permit and whether or not the person passed the driving test? So once again, what you are given for research is the time the person spent practicing driving. So time would be the explanatory variable, the independent variable. And whether or not the person is going to pass the driving test is something you're going to predict or find out the relationship. So that's why that is the driving test outcome is the response variable or the dependent variable. Now that's how we can classify variables into two types. But you can also classify variables further into four types based on whether the variables are categorical or quantitative. So based on that, you can classify variables into four types, which is categorical, explanatory, and quantitative response. The second type is categorical, explanatory, and categorical response. And the third type is quantitative, explanatory, and quantitative response. And the last type is quantitative, explanatory, and categorical response. This can be more easily understood by this table right here. So usually we just call it as C determines C or C determines Q, Q determines C. So C to C means we are talking about both the independent and dependent variables being categorical. And once again, I've explained what categorical variables are in my previous video, but I'll quickly tell you what that means. Categorical variable is a variable that you can divide into categories or labels. For example, the type of light a baby sleeps in. So those are there are only three types given, and that is a categorical variable. Gender is a categorical variable. But if you take somebody's score, that would be a quantitative variable, since you cannot divide it into some limited types. So that would be a quantitative variable, which shows quantity or measure. So now we are going to go ahead and review those four questions once again and try to decide what kind of case it is, whether it is C to C or C to Q or what. On the left side of the arrow, there is always the independent variable. And on the right side of the arrow, there will be the dependent variable. So let us see. This was our first question. Is there a relationship between gender and test scores on a particular standardized test? So in this case, we found out that the explanatory variable is gender and the response variable is test score. Now gender is categorical, so we can write that as C, and the response, the test score is quantitative because score can be anything, maybe from 1 to 100. So in that case, we cannot categorize it. So this is quantitative. So this is the case which is C determines Q. Let's see the next question we had. The next question we had was something like this. Is there a relationship between the type of light a baby sleeps with and that relation, the types of lights are also given in the question, which is no light, night light, and lamp, and whether or not the child develops nearsightedness. So we found out that the explanatory variable is the type of light and the response is nearsightedness. Now both the variables in this case, if we talk about light type, we are already given the three categories in the question itself. So that in itself is a categorical variable. But when we talk about nearsightedness is a yes or no question, whether the child will develop nearsightedness or not. So because it is yes or no, it is also categorical. So this is a C determines C type of case. The next question we had was this one. How well can we predict a student's GPA from his or her entrance test score? So in this case, we defined the explanatory variable as entrance test score and the response variable as GPA. In both cases, the GPA would be something out of 10 or out of 4. So either way, it is quantitative. And the entrance test score, because it's a score, it's definitely quantitative. So this is a Q determines Q type of case. And then our final question, which was, is there a relationship between the time a person has practiced driving while having a learner's permit and whether or not this person passed the driving test? So in this case, the explanatory variable is time and response variable is the driving test outcome. The time that is given to us could be number of hours, and those hours can vary from person to person. So that is a quantitative variable. But the driving test outcome is once again yes or no, whether the person passed or the person failed. So it can be categorized. So it is a categorical variable. So this is the case of Q determines C. And that's how you can classify variables and cases, which will help us when we learn hypothesis testing later on in inferential statistics. So I'll be back in the next video. I'll see you there, and thank you for watching.